It's a new month and we are done with the production process, kind of, because today I'm explaining something that is part of the production process. I thought that this specific topic needed its own episode or its own slides, just so that it really helps you with your preparation. So this is kind of part of production, but it's also just something everyone who sews should know. And this month we are going to get more into what you should know if you sew. Welcome. Have you ever looked at a pattern and just wondered which way is up, which way is down, what is the armhole and what is the neckline, and what do these symbols mean? Well, today is your lucky day. I am going to explain parts of a pattern. I had promised from last month's series that I was going to go deeper into patterns because it is part of the things you give a production team, whether it's your own team or your outsourcing production. Patterns are very important, and yes, the symbols are universal and it's important to know what they mean. So today I'm going to do a deep dive into that, and yes, the videos will be in slide form, so take screenshots if you have to and watch out for it in next. Fashion patterns. A pattern is a template from which the parts of a garment are traced onto woven or knitted fabrics before being cut out and assembled. Patterns are usually made of paper, and sometimes you can use a sturdier paper like cardboard if you want the pattern to last longer. There are various ways patterns are made. I'm going to get deeper into them in the next slides. Drafting. Drafting involves measurements derived from a sizing system or accurate measurements taken from a person, dress, or body form, basically so that you can create the other sizes. Measurements of chest, waist, hips, and so on. And then there's eases and allowances that are put on paper and on construction lines. And then you make it into a full pattern. So basically it's a foundation for designs, and it's used a lot by designers, especially in the ready-to-wear space, because basically you're trying to make things in multiple sizes, so you need a base of where you can do it, which is usually one of the mid sizes. So if you're going to do from extra small to extra large, then medium would be your average size that you derive all the other measurements from. So basically, apart from that, in Africa, we have a very popular method of drafting, which we call freehand cutting, which most tailors will just draw the pattern directly on the fabric. The issue with drawing directly on the fabric is that it leaves little room for manipulating the design. So I always recommend, even if you do use freehand cutting, always do it on paper first and then do your final on fabric. Another way people make clothes, especially people who do fashion as a hobby, it's cloning. Basically, you just take what you already have in your wardrobe that fits you well, and then you cut out patterns from it, and then you leave, of course, some seam allowances so that you can be able to fit it to the outfit, and then you sew it together. Flat paper patterns. This involves the development of a fitted basic pattern with comfort and ease to fit a person or a body form. Example of this is a slopper. This method is widely used in the ready-to-wear market because it's fast and accurate. So a slopper is a working pattern. That's how we called it in college. Basically, it's the starting point of a flat pattern. It's a simple pattern that fits the body well and easy enough for movement and comfort. As you can see from the rest of these images, there's no seam allowances in a slopper. So that is basically how it looks. You cannot yet use it like this because it doesn't have seam allowances yet. A block pattern is a sewing pattern previously created for clothing style that was perfected for good fit. So this is basically an upgraded slopper. After you are sure your slopper is fine, is when you make a block pattern, because now that has seam allowances, as you can see in the next pictures. Then lastly, we have the commercial pattern. Usually, if you've bought these before, they come in an envelope with an image on it. Usually home sewers buy it a lot, although designers can still buy it, especially if you're trying to learn and to cut a new style. And it comes in a very light paper, usually known as tissue paper, and it's very flimsy. My advice is just transfer it to a sturdier paper. And it has sewing instructions, it has cutting instructions, and it has everything. So these are the examples of a commercial pattern. So all in all, generally, I don't understand why in fashion terms a flat pattern is put very separate from drafting, because I feel like they are very related, but I'm just giving you the information as I found it. So there you go. Draping. Draping is derived from a two-dimensional piece of fabric around a form conforming to its shape, creating a three-dimensional fabric pattern. This fabric is called muslin, and muslin is transferred to paper to make the final patterns. So basically, the images you're seeing next are how you achieve draping. And these are the very, very basic forms of draping. Pattern making software. This enables you to input your measurements and draft out a pattern. These softwares draft patterns to fit your measurements specifically, eliminating fitting trial and error in the sewing room. I would definitely advise you to get into this process if you've already done your block patterns and you've already done your drafting and everything, so that when you get into the software and you're creating your pattern, you don't have to repeat the process. And the beauty of this, as you can see, is that you can easily grade the patterns the next size. Grading basically means making the pattern into multiple sizes, as you can see in the rest of this slide. And finally, 3D body scanners, the last method I am sharing about how you can make your own patterns. So this is definitely advanced technology where individual measurements are collected from a 3D body scanner. The measurements are used to create a virtual 3D model of your individual body, and then it uses the 3D and 2D softwares that allow the user to define a garment surface in relation to the 3D body model. So once the garment surface is defined, the application automatically unwraps and outputs a 2D flat pattern, and then you print it out as seen in these slides. I have looked into this, and it's not actually available in all countries, but it's also not cheap. But it's a very good advancement in pattern making. I wanted to show you how a basic pattern block looks like before they're separated, after drafting and after they're separated. And we're going to start with the basic bodice block, which is used to make dresses and tops and jackets. And this is how it looks like when it's basic. And then when you move on to the next one, that is two separated pieces of a top or even for a jacket. This is without any dart manipulation. And then the next one is a dress piece. After that, you get into the basic skirt block. This is how it looks like when you're drafting. And the next slide shows you how it looks like when they're separated. And then there's a trouser block, which usually seems very complicated because you draft both the front and the back in the same diagram. Once you've done that, then you separate the pieces and then you use the blocks now to alter it according to the design you want to make. And lastly, we have the sleeve block. This is just one of the ways you can draft a sleeve. There's another way. There's also two-piece sleeves, usually used in jackets, but this is how a basic sleeve block looks like. These are all for pattern drafting, and there are other methods that people use to create all these patterns. So lastly, now we're going to look at symbols you find on patterns and what they mean. So patterns, whether you make them yourself or you buy commercial patterns or you get digital patterns online, usually have these universal markings that will help you understand what you're supposed to do with the pattern. So we're going to start with the first one. A grain line is a heavy solid line with an arrow on each end that appears on all patterns that aren't cut on fold. The grain line indicates how to place a pattern on the grain. To do this, the grain line arrow must be placed exactly parallel to the selvage or sometimes diagonally across, depending, as seen in this example. Next, we have on fold. This is a bracketed grain line that indicates the pattern edge to be placed exactly on fold. The place on fold line must be exactly on the fold, as seen in this other examples. This is because maybe you want a double of the front. Example, if you don't have a front zip, you will have to cut the pattern on fold and then it comes out as double. I hope that makes sense from the diagrams. Then we have notches. Notches are diamond-shaped symbols that extend beyond the cutting line, so usually they protrude out. And they're used for matching seams and joining garments. Basically, it just helps you connect your patterns correctly, as seen in these examples, because sometimes if you don't do that, you might find that your patterns are not aligning or your garment is not aligning and you have to undo it. So notches really help with that. And also just helping you not mix up the patterns the wrong way. In a lot of commercial patterns, especially, you'll see dots, squares, and triangles. These are just symbols to help you match each section. Especially if you buy digital patterns, sometimes you find that the patterns are in pieces. So the person who designs them usually puts a triangle so that you can know that the pattern with a triangle on this end and the other one on this end will combine to create the whole thing. Because sometimes the patterns are way too big for the A4 paper, so sometimes you'll find all these symbols in patterns. They also help in other sewing terminologies, like if you're supposed to do gathering somewhere or you're supposed to join certain sections, these dots, squares, and triangles help in that as well. There is patterns that also have symbols that show you that how to place certain fabrics, patterns on fabric, like if you're supposed to play it on the wrong side or the right side, and then also if you need an interfacing and lining. These I'll explain in a video much later, but there are symbols like this on patterns as well. A cutting line is a heavy line that outlines the pattern pieces. Basically, this is where you will cut from. Some of them have scissors, some of them don't have scissors, some of them have different designs of lines to show different sizes, like seen in these examples. Especially for graded patterns, it's usually good to just highlight them sometimes so that you don't confuse them when you're cutting or tracing. There are also symbols to indicate whether there's a button or a buttonhole in your pattern, and it's usually shown with the symbol of a button or a dash, two dashes that look like a buttonhole, or a square, a rectangle that looks like a buttonhole. There's also a symbol to show that if you want a certain segment pleated or gathered, usually it comes with two straight lines and an arrow in between to show that that section of the garment is going to be pulled in together. Some patterns even give you an indication of the direction you should stitch. This especially happens when you're about to gather somewhere, so that you can be able to gather in the right way. So some patterns have directions of stitch. There is also patterns that consider that maybe someone would be taller or shorter, so they have this adjustment line where you can lengthen or shorten your pattern in very specific places. A very common pattern that you find this in is trouser blocks, where you want to make it a short, so they would indicate where you could start making it a short from, and so on and so forth. Or if you want to make the trouser longer, that is the line you'd cut it and another piece of paper and make it longer. And lastly, we have darts. Darts are basically what adds shape to your garment. So they're single-ended darts and double-ended darts. It really depends on where it is. Most double-ended darts are in the middle of your bodies, from your bust area to your waist area, so actually to your hip area. So usually you find them mostly in dresses, but single-ended darts are usually found on tops, skirts, bust area, and all that. So I'm sure after you read all that, you'll be able to understand, and these are the examples of how the darts look. And this is the end of this segment. Well, that's it from me this week. The pattern series, I'm going to actually talk about pattern drafting hacks in another video much later. So I hope at least you understand the basics of patterns. So if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section. I will get to it. I'll definitely answer. So this month, as I said, it's more about things people who sew should know. So I'm going to talk about mistakes next week, mistakes people who sew make. And I hope you'll join me then. And I guess I'll see you next week. Bye!